Behold, dear viewer, the image. A face drawn in stark black and white. The eyes are unevenly shaped, the eyebrows arched in deliberate asymmetry, the mouth stretched into a wide, jagged, leering grin that conveys, with an economy of line bordering on the impudent, the precise emotional state of a person who has just succeeded in inconveniencing a complete stranger for his own amusement. This face, scratched into an online drawing tool by an undergraduate art student in September of 2008, is, in the strict historical sense, one of the foundational artifacts of the modern internet's comedic visual language. Within 2 years of its creation, this face had spawned an entire visual genre, the rage comic, which would dominate amateur internet humor for the better part of a decade. Within 4 years, it had become so ubiquitous that the original artist would attempt, with mixed success, to enforce his copyright against multinational corporations, and within 15 years it had been retired into the curious afterlife of memes that have stopped being deployed in earnest, but are still understood, in the manner of a half-forgotten dialect, by everyone who lived through their reign. Our origin point lies, modestly, in a campus dormitory at a public university in Oakland, California, in the autumn of 2008. An undergraduate art student who at that time used the online handle Win was a regular contributor to a popular early 2000s online comic strip community. The community in question hosted a relatively simple drawing tool that permitted users to compose short, multi-panel comics directly in their browser. The tool's drawing capabilities were deliberately crude, which had given rise to an emerging house style of deliberately ugly, hand-drawn humor. On the 19th of September of that year, the student in question composed a short, 4-panel comic. The premise was simple. A figure recounts a small prank he had committed, making a noise in a public lavatory in order to fool a stranger into believing him to be in physical distress, then quietly remaining silent. In the final panel, the figure turns to the reader and delivers, in a single line of text, the rationale for his behavior. "I did it for the lulz." The face that appeared in that final panel was, the artist later confirmed, drawn in less than 5 minutes, without any premeditated intent that it would become a standalone, reusable image. He had simply needed a face that conveyed, in maximum efficiency, the specific emotion of mischievous self-satisfaction. He produced, by happy accident, the most efficient such face in the entire visual record of the early internet. What distinguished this face from the thousands of other crudely drawn faces produced in the same community, in the same period, by the same method, one quality, and one quality only. The face was, in its expressive content, instantly legible, without any caption, without any context. Anyone glancing at the face understood exactly what emotion it conveyed. Within weeks of the original comic's posting, users on adjacent message boards had begun extracting the face, cropping it from the comic, saving it as a small image file, and redeploying it independently in entirely unrelated contexts. One could affix the face to a description of nearly any small online prank, and the joke would parse. One could affix the face to a description of nearly any low-stakes act of mischief, and the joke would parse. The face had become, in effect, a punctuation mark. By the spring of 2009, the face had acquired a name. It was called, with the directness characteristic of early internet nomenclature, the Trollface. The name was a reference to the verb trolling, meaning the deliberate provocation of strangers for one's own amusement, which had emerged in the 1,990 seconds among long-form online discussion groups, and which was, by 2009, the dominant single-word descriptor for the category of online behavior the face represented. What followed between 2009 and 2012 was perhaps the most prolific outpouring of amateur visual humor in the history of the network. The Trollface had demonstrated, by example, that a single hand-drawn facial expression could serve as a portable, reusable comedic unit. Within months, hundreds of other crudely drawn faces had been produced by other amateur artists, each intended to convey a specific emotion with maximum legibility. One had a face for indignation. One had a face for embarrassment. One had a face for satisfied vindication. One had a face for the specific emotional state of having just defeated one's opponent in a small online argument by deploying an unexpectedly devastating retort. One had a face for the precise sensation of recalling, days later, a piece of dialogue one ought to have delivered at the time, but had not thought of in the moment. Each of these faces, dear viewer, had a name. Each of these names was widely understood across millions of users. The structural form that emerged from this expanding lexicon was the rage comic itself. A short, multi-panel composition drawn in deliberate crude line work in which a single small life experience, usually a minor frustration of urban life or an awkward social interaction, would be narrated using the established cast of expressive faces. By 2011, this format had become the dominant medium of amateur internet humor. Single image hosting sites devoted entire subsections to it. University students composed them between lectures. Anonymous office workers produced them at their desks. The medium was, for a brief window, the genuinely democratic comic form of the early 2010 seconds internet. What, precisely, made the original face? the jagged smirk progenitor of the entire genre. So disproportionately effective compared to its hundreds of imitators. 3 properties, in my analysis, distinguish the face. First, its asymmetry. The 2 eyes do not match in size or position. The 2 halves of the mouth do not mirror one another. This visual asymmetry conveys, almost subliminally, an emotional asymmetry, the sense that the face is in the middle of an action, not at rest. Second, the relationship of the mouth to the eyes. The mouth is in a smile, the eyes are not. This contradiction is the entire emotional content of trolling, distilled into a single visual contrast. Third, and most cunningly, the deliberate crudeness of the line work. A face this expressive, drawn with professional polish, would have looked sinister, drawn in the deliberate amateur style of the rage comic ecosystem. It conveys, instead, a kind of harmless schoolboy mischief, as if the face had been doodled on the back of a school exercise book by a student bored in lessons. By 2010, the face had escaped any meaningful possibility of containment. It had appeared on t-shirts, on coffee mugs, on phone cases, on stickers sold in shopping mall, novelty kiosks. The original artist, whose real name had, by this point, become a matter of mild public record, watched the proliferation with the same mixture of amused detachment and mild commercial frustration that has characterized the response of nearly every meme creator to nearly every uncompensated commercial use of their work. In 2010, the artist registered his original drawing with the United States Copyright Office. This was, in its quiet way, a significant administrative act. It established him, as a matter of formal legal record, as the rights holder over the specific image he had drawn. In the years that followed, he and his legal representatives pursued, with varying degrees of vigor and varying degrees of success, a series of actions against the most egregious commercial misappropriations of the face. The most consequential of these actions was, by reports, the resolution of a dispute with a major American video game publisher that had incorporated the face into the marketing materials for one of its 2011 releases. The settlement, on undisclosed terms, established that the face could not be used commercially without the original artist's permission. It was, like the broadly contemporaneous Nyan Cat settlement we discussed in a separate examination, a small but consequential precedent in establishing that internet-native artists retained meaningful rights over their viral creations. By 2015, the rage comic format had begun to fade. Its hand-drawn, crude line aesthetic had been replaced, in the principal currents of internet humor, by other styles. Photographic memes, ironic typography, layered absurdity. The Trollface itself was, by this point, perceived as belonging to an earlier era. One did not deploy it in earnest in 2016 without signaling, deliberately or accidentally, that one's online tastes had been formed in 2010. And yet, and this is a recurring observation in our examinations of long-tail memes, the face did not die. It retreated into a curious afterlife in which it could be deployed, in 2020 or 2025. With explicit ironic awareness that one was reaching back into the visual vocabulary of a previous era. To use the face today is to perform simultaneously the original joke and a commentary on the original joke. It has become, in the strictest sense, vintage. In 2023, the original artist released a limited series of high-resolution prints of the face, signed and numbered, which sold out within hours. The market for the original artifact, 15 years after its first appearance, turned out to be quite robust. Mischief, it seems, has good resale value. What, in summary, did the face accomplish? In a sense, almost grand in its modesty. It demonstrated that a single hand-drawn expression, scratched in 5 minutes on an undergraduate's browser, could supply the visual punctuation for a decade of amateur online comedy. It taught a generation of internet users that expressive faces could be portable. It taught them that the right face, deployed at the right moment, could carry the entire weight of a joke that no words were capable of conveying. One can argue, in fact, that the entire subsequent grammar of reaction images and emoji-based shorthand owes something, however, indirectly, to a young art student in Oakland, California, composing a 4-panel comic in a browser tool on a Friday evening in September of 2008. He drew a face. The face escaped. The face is not, in any meaningful sense, ever quite returned home. He did it, in his own words, for the lulz. An entire decade of online culture received it gratefully, in the same spirit.